Al Capone died on January 25, 1947. He was 48 years old. He died of cardiac arrest at his home in Palm Island, Florida. He had been suffering from late-stage syphilitic dementia for years, the specific deterioration that tertiary syphilis produces, the gradual destruction of neurological function. The man who had once managed a criminal empire worth over $100 million a year, no longer able to manage his own thoughts. He died surrounded by family, in his bed, in Florida. He was not shot by a rival. He was not executed by the state. He was not killed in the kind of dramatic ending that the movies would have you expect from someone who had ordered the deaths of perhaps 200 people. He died in bed, of illness, at 48, in Florida. I was 31 years old when he died. I remember reading the obituaries. The obituaries were, I want to describe this carefully, complicated. Not in the sense of being ambivalent, in the sense that the writers seemed uncertain of what tone to take. He was a murderer. He was also, in some sense that the writers struggled to articulate, something that American culture had produced and in some way valued. The newspaper clipping I have here is not from 1947. It is from 1930. A profile in a Chicago newspaper written during the height of Capone's power. The writer describes him as, and I am quoting, "a businessman who has given the public what it wants." A businessman who has given the public what it wants. In 1930, in a mainstream American newspaper. I want to spend this episode thinking about how that sentence became possible. Born January 17, 1899, Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Gabriele Capone, a barber, born in Castellammare di Stabia in the province of Naples. Teresa Raiola, born in the same town. They came to America in 1894 and settled in Brooklyn, in the Navy Yard neighborhood, which was a working-class Italian immigrant community. He was the fourth of 9 children. His father was not a criminal. His father was a barber. He ran a legal business in the neighborhood, and by all accounts was a respectable member of his community. The Capone family was not exceptional for poverty or for criminality. They were a working immigrant family in an immigrant neighborhood. Capone attended school until the 6th grade. He was not a poor student. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent. He left school after an altercation with a teacher. The teacher hit him. He hit back. The principal beat him. He never returned. He was 14 years old. What happened next followed a pattern that was common in immigrant neighborhoods in the early 20th century. Without school, he attached himself to the street. The street in 1913 Brooklyn had gangs, not in the organized sense that would develop later, but in the sense of groups of young men from similar backgrounds who spent time together and whose activities ranged from the mildly illegal to the seriously violent. Capone moved through several of these groups. He came to the attention of Frankie Yale, who ran a gang in Brooklyn and who gave Capone work, bouncer, enforcer, the specific physical labor of someone who was large, aggressive, and effective. It was during this period, approximately 1917 to 1918, when Capone was working at a bar and dance hall in Brooklyn, that he received the scar. The scar, 3 slash marks across the left side of his face, from cheek to jaw. The result of an altercation with a man named Frank Galluccio, whose sister Capone had insulted. The scar gave him the nickname he hated, Scarface. He preferred snorky, a slang term for elegance, for the well-dressed man. This detail, the scar he hated, the nickname he rejected, the preference for snorky, tells you something about who he understood himself to be. In 1919, Johnny Torrio invited Capone to Chicago. Torrio was building an organization in Chicago, The specific opportunity that Prohibition was about to create was visible to people who were paying attention, and Torrio was paying attention. He needed capable lieutenants. Capone was 20 years old when he arrived in Chicago. He was running the Chicago outfit by 26. I want to describe how this happened, because the speed of the ascent is part of what is remarkable about Capone, and part of what the story reveals about the specific economic environment of Prohibition. When Torrio established the Chicago outfit, the organization that would become Capone's, he pursued a strategy of negotiation and territory division, rather than immediate violence. He proposed to the various Chicago gangs a system. Each gang would control specific territories, specific product types, specific distribution channels. The division would be enforced by mutual agreement. Violence would be reserved for those who violated the agreement. This was, essentially, a cartel structure. It worked, partially, for several years. The problem? Cartels require trust. Trust requires either shared values or effective enforcement. In a criminal organization where the enforcement mechanism is violence and the shared value is profit, the cartel is always vulnerable to defection. Any member who calculates that they can gain more by breaking the agreement than by honoring it will break the agreement. When Torrio was shot and nearly killed by a rival gang in January 1925, a shooting that convinced him to retire to Italy, Capone inherited an organization and a cartel structure that was under pressure from multiple directions. Capone's response was different from Torrio's. Where Torrio had preferred negotiation, Capone used violence more readily. Where Torrio had maintained relatively discreet operations, Capone was public. This is the choice that defined him, and that made him both extraordinarily successful and ultimately vulnerable. I described in Episode 1 that Capone's estimated annual income in 1927 was $105 million. I want to make this number real, because large numbers become abstract. $105 million in 1927. In the same year, 1927, the United States federal government spent approximately $3 billion in total. Capone's personal income was approximately 3.5% of the total federal budget. The average American annual wage in 1927 was approximately $1,200. Capone's income was approximately 87,500 times the average American annual wage. He employed, directly and indirectly, approximately 1,000 people, not as criminals, as employees. Drivers, accountants, lawyers, bartenders, brewers, distillers, warehouse workers, hotel staff. His operations included bootlegging, the primary source of income estimated at $60 million per year. Gambling, dog tracks, horse tracks, casinos, the numbers game, estimated at $25 million per year. Prostitution, $10 million per year. Various other rackets, $10 million per year. These are not exact figures. Criminal enterprises do not file audited financial statements. They are estimates derived from federal investigation, journalistic research, and subsequent scholarly analysis. The order of magnitude is consistent across multiple sources. What $105 million bought in 1927? A fleet of armored cars. Capone drove a 1928 Cadillac Town sedan with inch-thick steel plating, bulletproof glass, and a police siren. It weighed approximately 7 tons. A personal staff of approximately 150 bodyguards at any given time. The corruption of the entire Chicago police force. Estimated payments of $75 million per year to police, politicians, and judges. And the specific lifestyle of someone who understood himself as a businessman and a public figure. custom-made suits, diamond rings, the best restaurants, the best hotels. The specific visible consumption of someone who wanted to be seen as successful by the standards that American culture recognized. I want to stay with the 1930 newspaper clipping. A businessman who has given the public what it wants. This was not an isolated sentiment. Capone, during the height of his power in the late 1920s, was a genuine celebrity, not only in the criminal world, in the general public. He was recognized on the street. He was photographed at sporting events. He attended baseball games and boxing matches and was treated by the crowds as a notable. He gave to charity. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression, a fact that was widely reported and that generated genuine public sympathy. In 1930, he opened a soup kitchen in Chicago that served approximately 3,500 meals per day. He gave interviews. He was accessible to journalists in a way that powerful criminal figures typically are not. He spoke in clear, direct language about what he did and why. He said, "I give the public what it wants. If I break the law, so does every man, woman, and child in the country who has a drink." He was not wrong that the law was widely violated. He was wrong about what that meant. But the argument was rhetorically effective because it placed him in the same moral category as the housewife who bought bootleg wine and the businessman who kept a bottle in his office drawer. If everyone was breaking the law, then he was merely the most successful person breaking the law. America, which was in fact largely breaking the law, found this argument more comfortable than it should have. Why? I have been thinking about this for a long time. The specific appeal of Al Capone to the American public in the late 1920s. He was visibly self-made. This matters enormously in American culture. The self-made man, the man who arrived with nothing and through his own effort built something, is the central American myth. Capone was the son of a Brooklyn barber. He had no inherited wealth, no family connections to power, no elite education. What he built from nothing. The fact that what he built was a criminal empire and that he built it through violence and corruption, this was, somehow, separable in the public mind from the achievement. The achievement was visible. The bodies were not shown in newspapers. The bodies. I want to describe what Capone's operation actually involved, because the public image of Capone as a charming rogue, the image that persisted even as it was being challenged, depended on the bodies remaining abstract. The specific violence, Capone did not commit most of the murders attributed to his organization personally. He ordered them. The distinction matters legally. It matters less morally. The method of enforcement in the Chicago outfit was, you violated the agreement, you were warned. You violated again, you were killed. The killing was carried out by specific members of the organization whose function was violence, men who were selected and paid for this specific work. The most famous single act of violence associated with Capone, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929. 7 members of the North Side Gang, which was the primary rival to the Chicago outfit, were lined against a wall in a Chicago garage and shot. 2 of the killers were dressed as police officers. The victims apparently believed it was a police raid until the shooting began. I will have a full episode on the massacre. Here, the aftermath. The photographs of the 7 bodies were published in newspapers across the country. 7 men against a wall. The public was shocked. And then, the public moved on. Not because 7 men being shot was acceptable, because the mechanism of moving on, the compartmentalization I described in episode 1, was already well developed by 1929. The public had been practicing it for 9 years of Prohibition. Capone was not directly linked to the massacre by any evidence sufficient for prosecution. He was in Florida on February 14, 1929. He was always, or almost always, somewhere else when the work was done. Capone was convicted on October 17, 1931. Not for murder, not for extortion, bribery, bootlegging, or the specific criminal enterprises that had made him rich and powerful, and that had involved the deaths of somewhere between 200 and 400 people by various estimates. He was convicted of income tax evasion. 5 counts, 11 years in federal prison, $50,000 in fines. The story of how this happened. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sullivan that income from illegal sources was taxable. This seems obvious in retrospect. In 1927, it was a significant legal development. It meant that criminals who could not be prosecuted for their crimes could potentially be prosecuted for failing to pay taxes on their criminal income. The IRS, specifically a team led by Special Agent Frank Wilson, spent years tracing Capone's finances. The challenge? Capone conducted his business primarily in cash. There were no bank accounts in his name, no property in his name, no financial records of his income. He had been careful. What Wilson found: the specific ways that cash had flowed through the organization, payments to suppliers, payments to employees, money that Capone had spent on clothing, on gambling, on hotel rooms, on restaurants, money that had to have come from somewhere. The prosecution could not prove where the money came from. They could prove that he had spent more money than he had reported as income. They could prove he had paid no income tax in the years in question. He owed the government $215,000 in taxes. For this, 11 years. I want to say what this tells us about the country. The country had spent 11 years watching Capone operate openly. It had watched him bribe the police and corrupt the judiciary and order the deaths of hundreds of people. It had watched and read and discussed and been shocked and moved on repeatedly. When it finally prosecuted him, it prosecuted him for taxes. Not because taxes were the worst thing he had done, because taxes were the thing the legal system could prove. This is not nothing. I want to be clear. Putting Capone in prison was a genuine achievement of law enforcement. The conviction was real. The prison time was real. But the specific charge, the gap between what he had done and what he was convicted of, tells you something about the limits of the legal system, and, more precisely, about the limits of the political will to use the legal system against him. Prosecuting Capone for murder would have required confronting, directly, the specific network of bribery and corruption that had protected him for a decade. It would have required calling witnesses who did not exist because they were dead. It would have required pursuing evidence that had been carefully removed. Prosecuting him for taxes required a dedicated team of IRS agents and several years of financial analysis. The country chose the path that was available. The path that was available was also the path that did not require examining everything else. Capone was sent first to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, then to Alcatraz, the new maximum security prison that opened in 1934 specifically to house high-profile prisoners. He arrived at Alcatraz on August 22, 1934. He was the most famous prisoner in the most famous prison in America. His behavior at Alcatraz, by most accounts, unremarkable. He was not a disciplinary problem. He worked in the laundry. He played banjo in a prison band. Photographs exist of Capone with the banjo, which have a specific surreal quality that I will leave you to imagine. By 1938, his behavior was becoming erratic. The syphilis, which he had contracted years earlier and which had gone untreated, partly because of his distrust of doctors, was advancing. The neurological deterioration was becoming visible. A man who had managed a criminal empire worth $100 million a year with apparent competence, was now having difficulty following conversations. He was released from prison on November 16, 1939, served 7.5 years of an 11-year sentence. He went to his estate in Palm Island, Florida. He never returned to criminal activity, not because of moral transformation, because by the time he left prison, his mind was no longer capable of it. He spent the last years of his life largely confused, cared for by his family, fishing occasionally in Biscayne Bay, playing cards. He died on January 25, 1947. I was reading the New York Times on the morning of January 26, 1947, when I saw the obituary. I remember thinking, that's the end of that.